you, Scott. Ambassador Edward Peck is a retired career diplomat with 32 years experience. He was chief of mission in Baghdad from 1977 to 1980. This was during the time of the Iranian Revolution and near the outset of the Iran-Iraq War. He's been a Foreign Service officer in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, and an ambassador to Mauritania. At the State Department, he worked on covert intelligence, Egyptian affairs, and political affairs. He served as Deputy Director of the White House Task Force on Terrorism in the Reagan Administration. And he has met with Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader. I'd be very interested if you'd tell us something about that. Ambassador Peck argued against invading Iraq prior to the invasion. He said then, quote, "When you take out Saddam Hussein, the key question you have to ask then is what happens after that?" At the time, no one in the mainstream media and few political leaders were asking that question. Just as today, as I said, almost no one seems to ask what would happen the day after if the U.S. were to attack Iran. We're looking forward to the remarks of this very unusually experienced person. Welcome, Ambassador Peck.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you can detect, it is a very difficult task to follow Scott Ritter as a speaker with anything that could possibly have, in my view, more meaning and impact. So I have decided to show a black and white video of my family's trip down the Colorado River, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. People are leaving already. Well, I need to tell you, I have a very, very active sense of humor. If you know anything about the diplomatic service, you will recognize that this is a dreadful burden to drag through the career. And the only reason I bother you to tell you this is that people who have a sense of humor always try to inject some humor. Please understand, I take these issues extremely seriously, and an effort at humor does not mean I do not take them seriously. It's merely my way. Scott Ritter has talked about the horrors of the possible war with Iran and has referred to the horrors of the existing war with Iraq. And he used in that latter context a word upon which I would like to embroider: quagmire. I had the pleasure of telling an audience on BBC not too long ago in response to a question as what I would recommend about ending our involvement in Iraq. And I said that we have relearned for ourselves and are busily engaged in teaching the rest of the world the true meaning of the word quagmire. Because if we stay in Iraq, it is a sure, certain, and unavoidable catastrophe. And if we leave Iraq, it's a different, sure, certain, and unavoidable catastrophe. We should not have gone. We have gone, and in theory, a nation such as ours would have learned some kind of lesson from this involvement, which people such as Scott Ritter tried desperately to explain beforehand, that when you go to a place like that, you should have some profound understanding of what it is you hope to accomplish and how you are going to accomplish it. In the case of Iraq, we were going to use that as a springboard to launch democracy throughout the Middle East. You remember this, I'm sure. So to illustrate the reason that I had concerns, I would ask those of you in this room who are over age 60 to raise your hand if you are fully and completely comfortable using all the capabilities of a modern cell phone. Okay, now I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this. Here is a cell phone. I use mine to press flowers, okay? This one actually shreds vegetables and does laundry, but this is a piece of hardware. I can hold that in my hand And it comes with an incredibly detailed instruction book that tells me precisely how to use it. But I don't use it much because I'm kind of afraid of it, in a way. The average senior citizen looks at a cell phone with the same level of comprehension with which a squid looks at a nuclear submarine. But I want you to think now about democracy in Iraq. Democracy is not a piece of hardware. You cannot hold it in your hand. There is no instruction book. Democracy is historical, psychological, philosophical, and it's experiential. And the Iraqis know nothing about it. And the Iraqis may not even be sure that that's the best way to go. So, how long will it be before democracy is fully functional in Iraq? Could be weeks. Could be weeks. They're not even sure what we're talking about, really. And who says democracy is the best way? Who says it's the only way? But think about this. By definition, you cannot impose democracy. What are you smoking? You can't force people to have a free choice. Democracy is something that you grow up with, that you learn from. And it's a process. One of my most profound feelings of perhaps marginal success in working on television was to appear on a show a few years ago, a national program which had two anchors, a left-wing wacko and a right-wing nutcase. You know how they work those things out. And the right-winger, who was a woman, was in New York, I was in Washington, but she put her finger in my face. And she said, "Let's get one thing straight here, Ambassador Beck." I said, "Peck," and she said, "Whatever." Okay. We were getting along nicely. She said, "Iraq is going to have a constitution based on ours." We said, Iraq is going to have an American constitution. And I said, "You are quite right, and that is why we have told them forcefully, repetitively, that they're only going to be allowed to have slavery for the first 77 years. And after 130 years, they must give the women a vote." Heavy silence on the other end. I mean, how many people in this room can tell me in which year Americans, for the very first time, elected senators instead of having them appointed by state legislatures? 1912. Thank you, sir. Congratulations. It took us that long to figure out that having senators appointed by state legislatures maybe it wasn't such a good idea. It was the 17th Amendment, I think, sir. Perhaps I'm not sure about that. Anyway, how in the world do you expect Iraq to take a weekend and write a constitution when it took the colonies, 6 years to do this? But today in the press, you will read journalists or other people of that kind refer to this is enshrined in the Iraqi constitution. Enshrined is kind of a strong word for something that most people are unaware of and don't understand and don't care about. But we have a mission in this world, and that is to make everybody precisely the same as we are, knowing that they desperately wish to be precisely the same as we are. An awful lot of them don't. But the key point here is that you cannot impose democracy. You cannot force people to make a choice. And if, in the case of Hamas, they have a democratic election and they choose their leaders, my country says, no, you chose the wrong guys. See, in a dictatorship, if they have a sham called an election, you know precisely who's going to win. But in a democracy, you don't. And the compelling facet of a democracy is that you might lose. And in the case of Hamas, I was there in Gaza in January of '06 as an international election observer. Think about this. At that time, the occupation had been going on for 38 years. It is, as you probably know, a pretty savage, pretty repressive, and all-inclusive occupation. But the Palestinians had a party in power called Fatah, which had been in power really for about 30 years. Fatah organized the elections. They set up the polling places and got the judges and all the rules and all this sort of thing all set up, and they ran the election and they said, we lost. Now that's democracy in action, folks. And America says, no, we are now going to induce for you, Hamas, democracy through starvation. That'll work, yeah. The survivors will love us for that. How in the world do we convince people that we mean well in the Middle East, but not exclusively there, when our only presence is involving the use of guns and bullets and helicopters and flamethrowers and tanks? Not only the ones that we use, but the ones that we provide for Israel. Now, no one in their right minds, and I recognize that there's a significant portion of the population of the world that does not qualify, no one in their right minds would want anything bad to happen to one single Israeli. I am of that persuasion. But by the same token, nobody should want a bad thing to happen to a single Palestinian. But above all, but for me and for my colleague, Mr. Ritter, we don't want bad things to happen to Americans. But the problem is that bad things have been, are, and will happen to Israelis, to Palestinians, and to Americans because of the perpetuation of the occupation. And I hope I am wrong. I do not wish to be right. I was on NPR a couple of months ago from Washington, and they said, you must be very proud that you correctly predicted what would happen in Iraq. And I said, not at all. Not at all. I was hoping I would be wrong. I didn't wish to be right, and being right does not make me happy, because look what is happening. And now, my country, my government says, well, that's worked so well in Iraq, let's try it in Iran. And the world says, wait a minute, let me see if I have this straight. Nobody can understand why the Iranians would be suspicious of our intentions, because we've never done anything to them before. But Congress appropriated $76 million to finance groups dedicated to the replacement of the regime. Now, try this for a question. What would the reaction be in the United States if tomorrow, from his hospital bed, Fidel Castro announced the granting of $60 million to the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Brothers? Bombs would fall on Havana. That's an act of war to finance people who are going to overthrow the government. We did it in Iran. It was $94 million in Iraq, $94 million there. And the rest of the world, and especially the people in the Middle East, are looking at us through entirely different eyes now than they did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and last week. They are afraid of us. They are concerned about us. They do not see us as bringers of truth, justice, freedom, and harmony. Because in the Middle East, we and our ally, Israel, have done terrible things to people. Now, I leave you with this thought. The papers tell us, now forgive me, I don't wish to be attacking the people in the media. Many of them, well, let's not go there. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that the media is not telling American people some of the things that they need to know and should know, even if they don't feel like it. For whatever reasons you wish to choose, Americans do not pay as much attention to events in the Middle East, perhaps as they do to what Britney Spears is up to these days. Because there's a lot more coverage of, well, actually there's less coverage of Britney now that I think about it, which of course is part of the problem. But how in the world do we present ourselves as the bringers of freedom and justice and truth if what we do is try to impose democracy at the point of a bayonet and punish those people who have democratic elections, but not the kind that we want? Are we encouraging cooperation? Are we encouraging understanding? I would say no, and I'm sorry to say that, because my nation today is listed at the top, if you've seen the polls run by the Pew Foundation. The number one threat to peace and security in the world is the United States of America. Yes. I mean, now that's terrifying to me. Us, however you say it, we are looked upon as destabilizing and fearful. Yeah, we are. Are their judgments any more accurate than ours? That's not the point, but that's the feeling. And of course, they don't hate us. People who have been on tour boats, cruise ships, know that you get off the ship and the people are very friendly because they may not like our country's policies, but they have nothing against us, except in the Middle East. You may Google, those of you who know which end of a computer to look at, you can Google Stahl Albright interview. Stahl as in Leslie Stahl, S-T-A-H-L. Google Stahl Albright or Albright Stahl interview, and you will see a small segment from 60 Minutes made in 1996, in which Ms. Stahl comes back from Iraq looking into the question of the Iraqi children dying in droves, because the United States in the first war there destroyed the Iraqi electrical grid. And as a direct result, the sewage treatment plants and the water purification plants in Baghdad became inoperative. They're big electricity users. In addition, because of the embargo, Iraq could not import chlorine to use as one of the main features of this process. So the crap, C-R-A-P-P-E, that's a French word, the crap goes into the Tigris River untreated, and it comes out of the Tigris River untreated and goes into the city water systems. And the people of Baghdad are drinking seriously contaminated water, as in seriously. And we all know that diarrhea can kill a child, but this is now manifold, serious infestations from untreated sewage, and the Iraqi children are dying. And the part you'll see if you Google this is terribly compelling because although that program was aired once in this country, it has been shown thousands of times overseas, especially in the Middle East. In New York, Leslie Stahl interviews the then ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright. This is not an effort on my part to demean or denigrate Dr. Albright, who had at that time the difficult job that I had for many years of explaining and defending American policy. But you will see Leslie Stahl with real furrows, stumbling, say, we have heard that 500,000 children have died. She said, why, well, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it? And the response, deadpan, is as follows, quote, I think this is a very hard choice, but the price, we think the price is worth it. It is probably the coldest thing you will ever see on television in your lives. 2 points. It doesn't matter whether the numbers are accurate. It does not matter whether or not we were responsible. That visual image is engraved in the minds of millions of people, just like the photograph of that poor girl running down the road in Vietnam with all her clothes blasted off, or the guy standing on the box at Abu Ghraib, or the trade towers coming down. She says, it's worth it. Now, anybody in this room who thinks that they hate us because we have freedom has never seen that video. Thank you.